Our first speaker, actually the first speaker is the person most responsible for me being in the position I am today, and that's Dr. Frank Gehry. He grew up on a dairy farm in upstate New York, received his BS and DVM from Cornell, his master's from The Ohio State University, and that's a little bit of a theme for our first two speakers. He worked at a dairy practice in upstate New York and then worked for advanced clinical training at the Maximilian University, Munich, Germany, and at the Ohio State University. He's a specialist in the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine, currently a professor at Colorado State, where he has been in the Department of Clinical Sciences since 1987. Since 1996, he's been the coordinator of the Integrated Livestock Management Program at CSU, and this is a multidisciplinary graduate studies program that focuses research and training efforts at problems in animal agriculture. All right, so I'm going to pull up his presentation here. He's actually in the room with us. I can see it.
Okay. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. I really appreciate the invitation, and I think back, as Bruce was talking about, and then Jason too, about the various NAHMS studies over time. I have to say, even though the weather is a little cold, it used to be a lot of fun to have the VMOs come to town, and then we would go traipsing around and doing really silly things like measuring calves and going to dairies, and those were fun times. However, times change, so here we are. And I got to admit, when Jason asked me to do this overview of the U.S. dairy industry, that really presented a challenge because there are so many things you could talk about that ultimately, you end up filling up this giant bucket that we could have a whole day-long session on how much changes in the industry. So I hope I chose well. What I will try to do is, wait a minute, it's this one here. So I just hit this button. Yep, there we go. Is I'm going to try and take this from a certain angle, which is I want to show you a bunch of things that hopefully you already kind of know, you're familiar with, but that you rarely really take the time to really look at the full scope of the changes that go on. And if anything characterizes the dairy industry, it is change. Now that's true in a lot of different places, but having been involved in the dairy industry for virtually my whole life now, it is pretty remarkable to see what things go on. The picture in the top left of the lady milking the cow, it's true, I'm not old enough that we were doing that. But the other two pictures are very representative of what our dairy looked like when I was a kid. And when you contrast that just with some very superficial type of views of what the dairy industry looks like, I mean, that alone is incredible. But what I'd really like to do now is go through somewhat step by step on some of the very different features that have radically transformed over time and that have either, was that a question? Okay, sorry. That have either precipitated other needs for changes or that are related with them in some way, because then I'm going to give you punchlines, things that you don't maybe automatically expect, but that really now are things, trends, or expectations for the future. So everybody will know that the dairy industry primarily is predicated on a grazing agriculture basis. And so the heart of much of the dairy industry in the United States originally focused on the northeast, north central, sort of eastern midwestern states, because that's where you had a lot of land that was not particularly arable, but you could make really good, you could get really good animal production out of grazing land agriculture. There were other big states. Texas and California have always been big players, but in general, the heart of the dairy industry in terms of the top producing states have typically been in the east because of the features of what the cows are, what they do. The picture in the upper right, as you can probably tell, those are not oak trees in the back. That's Florida. And really, a point that I'll keep coming back to at some point here will be that these things are not gone. In fact, grazing land agriculture is still with us. But because it was located in those areas, we got used to a certain style structure of housing, because whether you are in the east or whether you're in the west, about 6 months of the year, cattle can't graze. So we developed fairly substantial housing structures, most of which historically were either tie stall or stanchion type of barns, with most of the landscape populated by application of farming practices in the immediate proximity of where the barn was, and then the cows stabled during the wintertime. That, of course, is very different when you move to the western states, and part of the story of the dairy industry will be the upswing over the last 20 years probably of the arid western states is the most rapidly changing, most highly productive, most intensive dairy agriculture in the country. And part of the reason for that is because once you move west and you get into the arid countries, or arid areas, arid states, then you don't have grazing land agriculture. You have big dry lots. The dry lots keep costs down. You drive costs almost non-existent for housing because the cows are just basically loafing around. And you provide them some shade and some windbreaks, and you take them to a milking facility. But that changes over time too, because awareness of some health problems, some welfare problems, mastitis problems, somatic cell count problems. In the picture in the upper left, it doesn't matter where you are. If you have cows outside for substantial periods of time, sooner or later you end up with something that looks like that. And so the more recent swing, probably over the last 15 years or so, has been the development of bigger, more expansive, more fancy freestall housing structures, which were a novel change in the 70s and now are a really, really common housing structure even out here, and they are replacing dry lot dairies because of the fact that you can keep the cows inside and control a lot more about their environment and their exposure to pathogens and their dryness. So this is one of my here's where we're going slides. The biggest probably development in housing over the last 10, 15 years is the giant cross ventilation barns. These things are phenomenal, and I don't know if you live close to one, but once you move to a certain size and scale, and once you've committed to having animals inside, then you start looking at other environmental features that are a real problem. And we've always had heat stress in dairy cows because they are cold weather creatures, but now we begin to see, as production levels get up, much more the impact of what that heat stress does to reproduction, to productivity, to health events. And so on the top, you can see that lineup and all those little white dots running all the way along. Every one of those is one of these fans, giant fans that you see in the lower left. And they're going to draw air across the barn through one of these water curtains. And the air is going to cycle up and go down under baffles. And these barns are truly remarkable. You can be in the panhandle of Texas in 98-degree weather, walk into the barn housing maybe 1,000, 1,500 cows and have temperatures in the neighborhood of probably about 65 degrees. That is intense. These are remarkable. And most of the new barns I see going up now are starting to follow this trend. Of course, having cows inside brings up some other issues, some of which I think Nina van Kaiserlink will talk about, for example, will be tail docking or reasons for it or welfare issues. Once you get the cows inside, now you have concerns about their housing, stall design, manure management, and so I could carry on about some of the technological advances there. I won't address anything about the animal welfare because I think that's going to be covered adequately by somebody else. But how the stalls are designed and the engineering of what it takes to manage cows that change in size and shape as each decade passes on is a real challenge from the point of view of both housing and animal welfare. Historically, we used to keep calves inside the same barn as the cows, typically in fairly small stalls with really crappy ventilation, and that would be that picture in the upper left. We gradually moved towards individual housing of animals outside, and so you see in the lower left the standard hutch configuration with a pen out front. I hate them because they always get messy, versus the tethered calves in the upper right, which I love because everybody I know who tethers calves outside in this kind of environment has healthier calves. It's like almost a one-to-one correlation. I'm sure that somebody will argue with me. I love those types of housing. If you're going to house calves individually, I love the notion that they can move around to wherever the heck they want, and they don't break their necks, contrary to popular opinion. But in the lower right, now we start moving towards the new generation of how do we actually get calves more socialized. We start looking at group housing, especially in the northeast, north central states. We look at hoop houses and hot houses. And now the move actually, which has a lot to do with welfare and nutrition and labor management, is group housing and ad-lib, typically using acidified milk or some kind of milk replacement that preserves. Nutrition of cows has changed over time. Any place you go, you're going to have stored feed. And the better we can store, manage, control, chop, grind, mix the feed, the better we can control nutrition, the better we can control overall productivity of the cows. The technologies that go behind that tend to speak towards increased size of dairies, and that's a theme we'll get back to in a little bit, because a lot of those technologies lead to greater and greater intensity of the machinery management, basically of feed processing. The slide in the lower right, I don't know if it's too small to see, but that's a human, actually, one of my grad students, Craig McConnell, no longer a grad student, and my car. So it just gives you some size, some idea of the size of that feed bunk. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about environmental issues. It will turn out that for all the concern about cows and methane, on many dairies, the biggest contributor to air quality and to NOx gases and so on and methane production actually comes from the feed management. And so there's a lot to be gained from continued improvements in technology there. The housing structures, of course, lend themselves then both to the large-scale feed management, to changes in how we compose the feed, to the implementation of larger and larger equipment that then can deliver feed to large numbers of animals, and savings on labor, again, becomes phenomenal. And that actually has gotten fairly well controlled, and probably I would say the dairy industry is very proud of its ability to manage nutrition, both for the health of the animals, but also more importantly for their overall productivity. Milking management's changed, and in fact I am old enough that the picture in the upper left, that is in fact how we used to ship milk when I was a kid, in the 10-gallon buckets, or excuse me, cans that you put in a water cooler. I was too small to lift them in. I was always amazed how strong my dad was that he could lift those suckers up and drop them into the cold milk, into the cold water rather. Individual animal milking, a lot of destroyed knees of dairy farmers, milk houses where every single implement has to be washed by hand, now replaced by increasing levels of automation, of movement of cows to be milked rather than moving the milkers to the cows. So the development of a succession of different milking structures, including first herringbone parlors with pits, ultimately moving towards the more space-efficient parallel parlors. The picture in the upper right is a double 60 herringbone parlor. The biggest ones that I'm familiar with, a couple of them are right here in Colorado, would be double 80s. They're phenomenally. They're large. The cows will move in. But there's also other issues that go with them, and I think probably Nina will talk about some of those too, things like trauma of the cows and the need to train them to move. But the milking technology, automatic takeoffs, changes in flush systems that decrease the impact of infectious pathogens on the udder, it's remarkable what every year some new technology comes along that changes. The big push in a lot of places now is towards what are considered the most efficient of those types of milking parlor systems, which are the big rotary parlors, which are very easy then ultimately to not only automate in some regards, but also to monitor, you see in the lower left, milk flow, and then ultimately be able to identify through information technology transfers and measurements, things like milk conductivity, total milk weights, incident of mastitis, and ultimately we'll move beyond that to sampling of animals and to prediction of things like reproductive status. The new wave there, which has not swept the country by storm yet, but is gradually increasing in its popularity for, a number of reasons.
You're good.
I'm good. Are the automated milking systems, or robotic milkers. These have been reasonably popular, or gradually increasingly popular in Europe for over 20 years. And the technology that goes behind them gradually improves. The lasers that identify the ends of the teats, the ability of the cluster system to find all of the teats, the decreased failure rates, so that in some systems they have 98% accuracy of placement of the claw on the correct teats and then good milk out. The potential using these systems because of increased frequency of milking is either to increase milk production because of increased frequency or decrease labor by well over 10 into the teens percentages, which is pretty impressive. It also means that you can begin to really automate things that relate to milk measurements. Udder health, including per quarter measurements of somatic cell count, color, conductivity, Milk production, you can actually measure milk production per quarter because they go through tubes that actually measure it on a per quarter basis. Reproductive status, where you begin to measure on a more robust level hormones that are and or the proteins in the milk that reflect either part of the estrous cycle or pregnancy. Feed body weight changes, which you can measure because they enter that stall, and feed intake, all of which is automated, all of which goes into computer systems, and ultimately, at some level, really truly is robotic, replacing an awesome amount of worker input. The real question is where the break-even is for how you're going to implement that. Typical costs of these are about $150,000 to $200,000 per stall, which milks about 60 cows. And you can compare that, just to put that into perspective. These costs vary all over the place, but typical costs are $6,000 to $15,000 per stall in a standard herringbone. So for a 6 herringbone configuration, $50,000 to $180,000. And you can process a heck of a lot of cows through a 6 herringbone compared with one of these robotic milkers, which milks a max of about 60 cows. There are other issues that come up with them, and those will relate to some of the big features of the dairy industry of today. Some cow behavior things, where you put your labor management, milk quality, cow welfare. But this is one of those systems, and every year these get better, and I know of at least having through either directly seeing them and or people who have seen them, about 20 of these in place on modest-sized dairies throughout the country, and every 5-6 months or so there's some report from somebody in one of the dairy magazines, Dairy Herd Management or Dairy Today, about how they love their robotic milkers. So this may be one of those technologies that really is helpful for the small or mid-sized, high-tech type of dairy. We move further and further along towards electronic monitoring of a variety of things regarding milk. You know, at first it's flow meters, and then ultimately becomes electronic flow meters, and then those things process into information gathering systems, big computers that allow you to really see a lot about milk production and other aspects of cow performance. Milk handling has changed, mostly for the betterment of the product. So in the 50s, we changed, the PMO required commercial shippers to use bulk tanks. And so we had small bulk tanks, like the one in the upper left. Now we change how the milk flows, the speed at which it flows, the speed with which it's cooled, and you literally can achieve now milk coming out of the teat end of a cow, never seeing the light of day, and being chilled from 102 degrees Fahrenheit down to about 37 degrees Fahrenheit in about 30 seconds, which is about the time that it takes it to get to one of the really big tankers. And we now design bulk tanks to approximate the size of the big trucks that drive the milk along so that you can maximize fuel efficiency, you can maximize pickup. And in fact, in the western states, the way you decide how many cows to have on a dairy is how many cows you can predict to fill a particular size tank, which then coordinates with the milk hauler so that you can optimize on transport charges, which is pretty incredible. That's not something we used to do that very long ago. It changes the way we use labor. It changes who takes care of the cows. It changes who we consider as the veterinarian or the person providing animal health observance, oversight, decision-making, treatments, so that in many Western dairies, and in fact this is one of the NAHMS statistics that you can proof check me on, in 2007 the NAHMS study reported that 10% of dairies in the Western states with over 500 cows do not use a veterinarian for their reproductive management. They typically use a paid on-farm laborer. That's pretty incredible. Now, for some veterinarians, this is going to turn out to be a very substantial challenge. They don't want to be that guy that's in the right-hand picture, and they don't want to be given the injections. They do want somebody else doing that work, but then they're not quite sure what to do when they don't need to do reproduction anymore, they don't need to do DAs anymore, and they don't doctor any sick cows. So it presents an interesting challenge to what the veterinary profession will do in working with the industry moving forward, and I hope I have strategized the content of this talk well enough to actually address some of that. Finish. So, we've even changed the cows. Over a substantial period of time, of course, we used to have 6 dairy breeds. We call the others the color breeds, the ones that don't count anymore. Well, Jerseys count a little bit, but not past 10. And then there are the brown Swiss, and some people kind of like them. But otherwise, milking Shorthorns, Guernseys, and Ayrshires kind of disappeared from the scanner. The dairy cow is, of course, as any fool knows, a black and white, or maybe even a red and white Holstein. But that changes too. Now there's increased interest in, for a variety of health reasons, management reasons, productivity reasons, longevity reasons, and increasing numbers of people have gradually started playing with crossbreeding. My favorite is the lower right because of my time spent in Germany. That is a Holstein Fleck V cross, and if you really want to have a dairy that can produce beef and milk at the same time, this is the cow of the future. Most people, of course, will argue with me, but I love those cows. They're gentle, they're kind of fun, and they're a little too big and eat too damn much feed, but their advocates will tell you that they are really efficient cows, and they are remarkably healthy. So, for a bunch of reasons, we even now changed the cows. And that in itself is telling, because I'm going to get back to that. All of these changes are going to end up with what I would consider to be somewhat ironic punchlines, because that doesn't mean all these really cool changes, that everything is just hunky-dory in the dairy industry. Last but not least, I wanted to point out that our consumers have changed. Our consumers have changed, their preferences have changed. This is only one slide because I could talk about expectations at the supermarket. I could talk about fluid milk consumption. We could talk about distribution of where people buy their food and about different types of soft products and class 1, 2, and 3 milk. I only want to talk right here because I just think this is amazing that in just the short time frame from 1970 to 2009, look at the pie charts and see how cheese consumption has changed. And what you wouldn't see, because the printing is a little too small, is that in fact, in that time frame, we not only have changed the types of cheeses we eat, but we've tripled cheese consumption per person in the United States per year. And in fact, if you look at the green one, just to give you one example, back in 1970, consumption of cheddar cheese was about 5.8 pounds. If you look at the lower pie chart, you'd say, oh yeah, cheddar cheese is down. No, cheddar cheese is twofold increased. It's just that we consume a boatload of mozzarella. So Leprino and Pizza Hut have been highly successful in convincing us that, damn it, that mozzarella is pretty darn good stuff. We make a lot of it here in Colorado, so I'm very proud of our mozzarella cheese. So those are some changes. I hope that gives you some idea, overview of a historical perspective of the types of technological changes and conscious decisions that have been made by dairy producers over a very sustained period of time. Now I want to show you what that reflects as in the demographics of the dairy industry. And you've probably seen these. In fact, I get these slides, as Jason was saying, as Bruce was saying, mostly through NAHMS, because these are the things that get published, and I go, oh, that's a great graph. I need that one. And I use these things like all the time. But I want you to see something from this graph. This graph goes from 1870 to 2010. I want you to notice that the peak is in 1940. I want you to notice that the slope, upslope, from 1870 through 1940 parallels the increase in human population in the United States. In other words, for a very prolonged period of time, if you had more people, you needed more cows. And then after World War II, something really amazing changed. We don't believe in it anymore, of course, because we don't believe in climate change and a bunch of other things, and a lot of people are anti-science. But somewhere along the way, somebody bought into the concept that science and technology were pretty darn cool stuff, and all of a sudden started applying them wholesale in the dairy industry. And so despite the fact that the human population in the United States from that time has continued to go up, in fact, from, let's see, 1930, human population was about 120 million people. And out of that 120 million people, there were about 6.4 million farms, which means that one farm fed about 20 people across all types of farming structures. But what this shows you is, man, agriculture just changed completely in the aftermath of World War II. And so now those numbers drop in the face of ongoing increases in the human population, which means that the number of dairy operations over pretty prolonged periods of time continue to decrease. This is just a shorter time span. This is the 20 years from 1991. And what you can see here is a very consistent, ongoing decrease in number of dairy operations. 67% decrease in just 20 years. Milk production per cow goes up, 44% increase over exactly that same time frame. And it's unrelenting. I mean, it's unclear where that level of productivity per cow might level off or stop. From a genetic point of view, it doesn't have to. It's unclear what other constraints are going to intervene that maybe change the inflection of that curve. But for right now, it's pretty linear. Total milk production, therefore, as a result, has gone up 35% on the shoulders of fewer cows with greater production per cow. And just to put that into a context, in the 55-year time frame from 1950 to 2005, we have decreased cow numbers to less than half. We've increased milk production per cow by quadrupling it, and therefore the total production has gone up by over 50%. That's amazing. That's industrial ag. And so here's a nifty, I hope I can make this work. If I can't, I'll be sort of sad, but oh yeah, here's my, I think this will go now. No, it may not work. This is a slide I got from my good friend Dave Galligan, who's a nutcase who makes these things called dashboards, and he takes real numbers scattered through time to then calculate and show how certain changes occur in synchrony during that time period. So I'm going to see if I can actually make this work. Yep, there it goes. I'm just showing you here the time frame from, as you can see, the time frame is up at the top. Milk pounds per cow per year is on the left. Cow numbers is in the middle. And total milk production is over on the left. I'm going to do that again for you because then I'm going to expand to this, right? Okay, look at this. Now this isn't going from 100 to 0. Those things obviously have their, you can see the numbers at the bottom. But if you watch...
It's not moving here.
Oh, it's not going on that? Oh, darn. So that means, oh, crap. That's a shame. This is like so cool. This makes me want to pee my pants. This is like damn, this is my...
Click on this play arrow.
We can do it ourselves.
Oh, well.
Do it yourself.
Is Dave Galligan on the line? Darn your hide, you should have made this work on this system. It's too bad. In any case, what it would show is that all of those bars move, and then he also provided, and I thought this was my opportunity to do it, is that all of that industrialization, many of the people in the consuming public, and if you read many media reports, are scathingly critical of industrial agriculture for its carbon footprint. We use more oil than we do food and blah, 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 and of course it's killing us all. In fact, statistics say because of those types of efficiencies and increases, the target was not to decrease the carbon footprint. But when you actually decrease inputs and increase outputs, then the carbon footprint changes. The per cow carbon footprint has increased by well over 50% in the last 40 years. But the per milk production carbon footprint from 1944 until today has decreased by 64% on a per milk basis. And that's what this, the like analytic could show, is that the environmental impact per cow increases because we do indeed pump more inputs into the individual cows, and we do expect more of the cows. But when you decrease cow numbers by over 50%, the total carbon footprint per unit production of product for humans drops. And it doesn't just drop, it drops dramatically. It drops by over 50%. That's pretty impressive. So anyway, that was my slide to show you that, and I'm really sorry I can't. Meanwhile, why do all these changes occur? Well, they're driven by primarily some of it is driven, of course, by the way people think, and there are innovators in the industry, and there are scientific innovators who just say, this would be cool, I'm going to try this. A certain amount of it is competition. But a big part of it is the way the market is based. You will all know that the overwhelming majority of milk production in this country is commodity-based. In other words, it's sold on a commodity market, which means that all pricing and supply-demand is done at the aggregate level, which means for the individual producer, they need to be able to deal with the fact that they are price takers, not price makers. And this graph just shows the time frame from 1996 through 2012 and gives you some idea of the variation over that, let's see, what is that, almost a 15-year time period for milk prices. The most notable, of course, occurred in the span from 2008 to 2009. The dairy industry had gotten very proud of itself because it had increased exports, the export market, from about 2% up to about 11%. And for every approximate 1% of use of milk in shipping it out of the country, not for domestic use, you can pretty much assume there's about $1 difference in farm level, farm gate price of the milk. So all of a sudden, some dramatic things changed in the span from '08 to '09. In about a 3 to 6 month period of time, milk prices plummeted from an all-time high, about $21 per hundredweight, down to about $9 a hundredweight. That was the biggest single drop in milk prices in that kind of a time span in the history of the dairy industry. That's over a 50% drop. For a producer to withstand that, you need certain types of structures within how the farm's designed, and a lot of that goes to issues that relate to economies of size. And so there are actually benefits to being very large in the face of those kinds of challenges. Economies of size speak to full use of existing resources. We develop better technologies and better equipment, and you can be more efficient in the use of it. It turns out that you can more fully utilize those fixed costs that you put in place if you're bigger and you spread it over a greater amount of productivity. Technology. Some technologies are size neutral. Other technologies are not. And so certain types of harvesting technologies will be more easily covered in large-scale operations than they will in small-scale operations. And so the good news is not all technologies fit that, but some do. Engineering economics, the price of the equipment, if you get a tractor, which everybody needs some kind of a tractor to do push-ups, it actually is not proportional to the size of the equipment. You could get 3 times the size of the tractor, but it does not cost you 3 times as much. So you can do 3 times as much work, but in fact the cost is a lot lower. Use of specialized resources. A lot of the resources that farmers or producers access these days, so for example, I mentioned to you about the bulk tanks and the plate chillers and so on, and a lot of the cost recovery and energy efficiency things are more easily applied at large scale levels. Input prices you can get, whether it's selling cull cows or whether it's input prices for feed, you can get certain cost recoveries by buying in bulk. And if you can manage your system well, then you can get premiums for some of the output. So for example, if you sell cull cows on a tractor trailer load that are body conditions score 4 and are all white fat cows, and you can sell them to the Green Bay market instead of going through a buyer at the sale barn, yeah, you get like 50% more for your cows. So there's things that work to your advantage. So with those things said, it should not be a giant surprise that most of the expansion, the change in the dairy industry in terms of productivity expansion has mostly been in the arid western states, which is a kind of a weird deal because that's not where historically one would have expected it to be. And so this just gives you an idea of California, the Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest as being the places where really substantial increase in daily milk weight shipments take place, whereas the upper Midwest and Northeast have had much more modest expansions. And that leads to this type of a map here, where you see that much of dairy production has shifted to the western, southwestern states. Who knows where this will go in the future? Part of the reason that's facilitated is, of course, as I mentioned, housing costs can be way lower, although we make changes now that make the housing costs go back up by instituting different types of barns. Water is really cheap, and sunlight is free. So you can produce feed way more efficiently out here, where you can cut alfalfa 4 times per year than you can by struggling like the doughty farmer someplace in upstate New York to see if you can harvest at least 2 cuttings that you can put into a silo. So we can get incredibly high value feed for much lower input costs than you can in most other places, mostly because at some level it's been subsidized by cheap water. Will that continue over the next 10 years or 15 years, or where will the dairy industry shift back? I'm sure if we give this talk 10 years from now, there's going to be a different angle to the story. That just has to be true. I'm not a sage enough guy to predict exactly what that will pan out to be, but there's no way things are just going to keep going on a linear trajectory from now into the next 50 years. What I want to point out, and this is the kind of twist part that I think is really important, is with everything I've shown you now, it would be very easy, and many people I think do this, to assume the dairy industry is in fact characterized by large scale, large numbers of cows, incredibly high productivity, intensive technology applications, and so on. And part of the reason we do NAHMS studies is because that ain't true. That is like not true. Those are the ones we pay attention to because they're like super cool. And I love seeing robotic milkers, and so does everybody else, because they are like really cool. But the truth is that when we look at the dairy demographics in 2011, the number of operations with less than 100 cows is bigger than all of the others. That's actually, as a total number of operations, that represents 2/3 of the dairy industry. If you start moving up, you can see that for operations of 1,000 to 1,999 or greater than 2,000 cows, we have less than 2,000 of them, fewer than 2,000, okay? Now, look at the percentage of inventory. Of course, because there are so many small farms, we have a fairly substantial inventory on small farms, 17%. But with only 800 operators at greater than 2,000 cows, that's twice as big as that at 32.5. Okay? For percentage of production, because the smaller farms on average tend not to be as highly intensive and productive, we got 14% of the production. And from those 800 farms, with 2,000 plus cows, we have 35. Over 1/3 of all production comes from those farms. This is standard across all livestock agriculture in the United States. If you look at the beef industry, if you look at the poultry industry, if you look at the swine industry, if you look at the dairy industry, it's easy to replicate this same type of a pattern. And it looks something like this. This is the pie chart that would show you some of those same reflections. On the left-hand pie, operations with milk cows by herd size. The red, the green, and the yellow represent, in 2004, over 3/4 of all dairies in the country. When you move up to 200 cows, which is still arguably a pretty modest-sized family farm, mostly populated by family workforce, and now you've accommodated 7/8 of all production. Moving to the 200 to 2,000 plus farms is all in that little series of pies down in the bottom left. Okay? If you look at percent of milk by herd size, now all of the pie sizes change completely. All of a sudden, 1 to 29 cows is 1.2%, 30 to 49 cows is 4.9%. When you look at size of farm less than 100, we have less than 20% of all of that production in 2004. So what I did is I inputted numbers from 2011, and they look like this, okay? And what you'll see is that that trend remains true. By 2011, those numbers have changed a little. So 1 to 29 cows now moves to 32.3. You can see that those numbers are different, but not by much. Okay? And if we look at the same thing for percent of milk by herd size, I've inputted again those same numbers. So yes, what really is dramatic is the speed with which the 2,000 plus cows have become phenomenally productive and dominate the market and have over 1/3 of all market share in terms of milk produced by less than 1,000 dairies. That's with a total herd size of somewhere in the mid-50s, mid-50,000 total number of herds in the country. Which again, is partly a reflection of people's attempts to buffer against, swings in milk prices, and that, of course, it changes the way they see what their options are for changing. Those things drive a bunch of other technologies, and so I'm done talking about the specific changes per se in the demographics, and I'd now like to move on to some of the other sort of issues or the things that relate to that. This is the classic lactation and reproduction cycle of dairy cows, and so you can see for cows you have a peak and then a gradual drop-off of milk production. That's their persistence. Heifers are more persistent, so that's the blue line there. And the focus on reproduction is because when you look at that bottom graph of how long is it going to take them that they're in milk, the longer you go out, the less milk they're going to produce. So there's a premium for shortening the time until they turn back around and start milking at peak levels again. Gestation is fixed. That's at 280 days. You can't change that. And so what you can change is days open. So there's a phenomenal level of focus on reproduction. And in fact, I will suggest, and I'm going to show you this in just a minute, that focus is inordinate. That the focus on reproduction is in fact so overwhelming that that's all that most people think about. And our information technologies and management and veterinary intervention are way imbalanced in looking at reproduction as the main driver and ignoring over long periods of time issues that relate to health. Information technologies are adopted much to actually manage that. So we have monitors for animal movement. We now have got these triangulating receiver systems that you can put on large farms and look at how frequently cows move, how far they move, and there are computer algorithms that will tell you when cows are lame, when cows are in estrus, when cows are getting ready to deliver. People have developed rumen boluses to track body temperature and therefore predict estrus and or say that the cow is getting sick. We have automated techniques for looking at blood and milk metabolites that we can use to estimate things about cow health, and we can evaluate reproductive hormones. All those technologies change each year. So in fact, that pressure on veterinarians of, you know, I can live without you because I can actually monitor all of my reproduction with no veterinary intervention. I can either take blood samples or I can have those hay use an ultrasound. One of the impacts of that focus on reproduction is that we've lost track of some things that I think are incredibly important. If you look at percentage of herd removals, the two biggest reasons for removing cows from herd, longevity, cow longevity on herds has decreased consistently over the last 20 years, is either poor production or the number two reason is because cows have died. I'm going to show you a little series of graphs that emphasize the degree to which that's true. This is in a 10-year time frame from 91 to 02, and these are data derived from DHI Prova from the 9 western dairy states. You'll see that overall removals are somewhere in the mid to high 30s. But you see the bottom little red zone? I'm going to expand that. Over that same 10-year period, mortality rates were doubling. This is not exclusive to the western states. This is characteristic across the country, not necessarily with exact same magnitude. This is characteristic in Mexico. This is characteristic in Italy. This is characteristic in Denmark. This is characteristic in the UK. Wherever you intensify production, mortality rates seem to climb. This actually gives you the more updated thing from DHI Provo, which shows that over the last 4 or 5 years, from 07 on, now you see gradually increasing removal rates because cull cow prices are even higher. And if you cull deep enough, you can gradually mitigate the death losses. So gradually the death loss curve goes down. I will argue, as somebody who happens to like cows, that I don't think the way you keep cows from dying on your farm is to cull them a little bit more quickly. Something's wrong with that equation. And what I think's wrong with it is information management. Our dairy information systems are so focused on reproduction and milk production. I just showed you some of the technologies that do that, that they are incredibly focused on current status. Any dairy producer can tell you, oh yeah, well, my herd milked 92.5 pounds today. But ask them how many cows died in the last month. Ask him how much salmonella there is on the farm. Ask how much BVD there is on the farm. Ask if he monitors other aspects of either infectious or non-infectious disease. And in fact, they can't answer almost any question about that. So we focus exquisitely on certain things, we ignore others. These computer systems are great at generating to-do lists. Most veterinarians who show up on farm run the list and then go and do their tasks and then run away. Health events are poorly defined. There is an initiative now that has been well defined by a relatively few individuals to change the way we not only evaluate health events, but how we input them into the information systems. But the current systems, most data is entered without veterinary input. I virtually cannot identify a veterinarian in the country who is integrally involved. Few exceptions, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. But 99.9% of veterinarians in this country have no input into culling decisions. They cannot tell you about who gets culled from the farm. They cannot tell you the condition of those cows. They cannot tell you the magnitude of that. They cannot tell you their body condition. They cannot tell you the reasons they're culled, except when they go to the dairy comp records, in which case you're getting what the producer decided to put in. All right? They're not configured to analyze cause and effect, and we need to change that. And beyond that, looking at specifically death losses, necropsies done by veterinarians on farms occur very infrequently. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't track death losses. These are NAHMS data, but all of that data that you see there, which suggests that lameness and injury is a remarkably common thing on dairies, attributing for 20% of all death losses, all of that is based on producer guesses of the reason the cow died. Very few veterinarians actually engage in this. This is, in my mind, a really, really significant opportunity for veterinarians in the future to move towards the practice of veterinary medicine as the guardians of animal well-being and health. This gives you an idea of the types of clinical illnesses, again, NAHMS data, and shows that clinical mastitis, lameness, infertility problems are very robust on dairies today. They occur with great frequency. Health information is very difficult to work with on dairies. It's easy to pull it up on the files, but if you put bullshit in, you tend to get bullshit out. So if we don't have close monitoring of what data goes in, then we have to deal with the fact that it may or may not reflect the reality of what's really going on the farms. As a simple example, you cannot say how much lameness takes place on a dairy based on the dairy records, because what you're really looking at is the number of cases that were identified by somebody in feed, not the number of cases that actually occurred. There's a big difference between those two, okay? And so I think it's really good, and we're at an inflection point now where we're going to start looking at that. And there's a number of advocates of this. My good friend John Wenz up at Washington State is probably the premier promoter of changing the way we use health information. Programmatic reproductive management's become routine, but other aspects of health management are poorly monitored. We have developed lots of protocols which give good prescriptions for how a hired worker can work with sick cows, but they're often not followed. That puts a premium on issues for the future of worker training and education. It puts a premium on monitoring for process control rather than producer-identified problems that you can dig up retroactively in an information. Put a focus on the need for data management on an ongoing or real-time basis with realistic data going into the information systems, okay? Well, I think there are a lot of opportunities for veterinary involvement and intervention, which include looking at transition cows and their health issues, metabolic disease, body condition, monitoring these, looking at representative examples of sick cows, rumen health and feeding systems, animal handling systems, and welfare audits. And I think some of those will be addressed in this NAHMS study. We'll be asking questions about a bunch of those things, and some of the other speakers will address them too. Jason, I need to stop in like 4 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going to give you one last soundbite, and then I got to go. Sorry. I knew there would be too much stuff, but it's okay. I'm having fun. I hope you're having some fun. And you can only go so far, and so there will just be stuff I didn't say that I thought was kind of fun. Residue testing. Dairy producers have long thought that residue testing of their industry was robust, and they're very proud to say, and they are right, that every single load of milk that leaves the farm is tested for residues. Darn it, it's true. That's true. Absolutely true. And all the plants do it. And they have a very narrow focus on what they test for, which are the things that theoretically end up in the milk if you apply certain types of treatment. Most of them are beta-lactams. Very few other antibiotics are tested for. Let me see. Something changed there. Wait a minute. Here we go. I can change the slide. In fact, what we see is that while at the producer level, that's the little sort of yellow bars, numbers of violations have gone down. We've done a really good job of decreasing violations in tankers, and of course it's gone to pretty much zero in the pasteurized products. So the dairy industry will tell you, oh, our residues are very low. Unfortunately, when you start looking at a different aspect of the dairy industry, which would be the cull cows, now you find a slightly different story, depending on how you want to tell that story. Here is a rundown from a time. This writes oldest is at the bottom. Over on the right, you'll see year 2003 up to 2009. This includes beef cows, fed cows, dairy cows, veal, and then the total. And what I want you to see is if you look at beef cows and feeders, the number of residue violations based on targeted sampling over about 35 million animals slaughtered per year is crazy low. We're talking about thousandths of a percent, okay, 10,000ths of a percent. The bad news is that dairy cows are up in the hundredths of a percent, and in fact, cull dairy cows represent 45% of the non-fed animals, so a relatively modest contribution to the beef industry. It's about 10% of total beef eaten, but dairy culls represent 67% of all cattle positives and bovine 24%. And so FDA, not being totally asleep at the wheel, decided this last year to target 900 farms that have had tissue residues and apply that scrutiny back to the bulk tank. If you can find violative residues in the carcass, maybe we should be looking at other antibiotics and other types of drugs in the milk. Of course, dairy producers got their knickers in a twist about this because, well, wait, you don't want to check up on us. I think what's going to happen in the future, there's increasing public scrutiny that says if you say you do something, then darn it, we're going to check you and make sure it's true. And so we don't have those results yet, but I predict there will be increased and ongoing increasing scrutiny of residues, antibiotic use, prescription use, and also as it relates then to antimicrobial resistance types of development. So of the 33 million total cattle harvested, oops, wait a minute, I just showed you the slide, so I should move on. Oops, something's wrong. No. Okay, and I think I should probably stop there because I'm going backwards. I was going to talk about organic and I was going to talk about raw milk, but you guys know that stuff anyway, and if not, then you can ask me a question later. So anyway, I appreciate your attention. I hope that was fun.